This is a Mercedes-Maybach S600, and it is the most luxurious Mercedes-Benz you can buy. In the United States, the starting price of this vehicle is $200,000, and with options you can easily get up to $225,000, which is a lot of money considering the base model S-Class starts at just $92,000. This S-Class is 2.5 times the price of a base S-Class. And today, I'm going to show you why. First, I should mention I've borrowed this Maybach S600 from Dutton Garage here in Melbourne, Australia. Dutton is a dealership with an incredible inventory that includes some of the greatest exotic cars ever made and some other interesting special cars like this one. You can check out a link to Dutton's inventory in the description below. Before I show you around the S600, a little background. Now, Maybach, and yes, that is the correct pronunciation, Maybach was initially a luxury car brand like 100 years ago. They went out of business in the 1940s. Mercedes-Benz revived the Maybach name in about 2003 to create a new ultra-luxury brand to rival Rolls-Royce. Only the cars they came out with were huge flops. They looked way too much like the regular S-Class, no one was paying the big money they were asking, and it was a failure, and Mercedes-Benz quickly pulled the plug. But Mercedes still owned the Maybach name, and they wanted to use it, so they came up with a different strategy. Instead of Maybach having its own products, it would instead be a top-end trim level of regular Mercedes-Benz models, sort of like Denali is to GMC. The S-Class was the first car to be Maybachified, if you will, and they offer it in two versions. There's one with a V8, or you can get it with a V12. This one has the V12, and it is glorious. So today I'm going to show you around the Mercedes-Maybach S600, and I'm going to show you all the cool quirks and unusual features that distinguish this $200,000 S-Class from a base level $90,000 S-Class. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and see how it drives, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the Mercedes-Maybach S600, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of used luxury cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader that you can buy for the price of a Camry. Now I'm going to start under the hood so you can gaze at the giant V12 inside a $200,000 Mercedes luxury sedan, or at least you can gaze at the plastic cover over the V12. Now, like I mentioned, this is the top end model. There was a V8 and then there was this one with the V12. It says 523 horsepower and 612 pound-feet of torque, which is insane. But this is a 2017 model. For the 2018 model year, Mercedes updated this car. They now call it the S650, and the V12 now has 621 horsepower, which is really insane. Next up, we got to talk headlights, because these are just about the coolest looking headlights in the car business. Take a look at them. They look like they have eyes in them. You can see the eyeball in the middle, and then they sort of come to a point on either end. And while the left headlights are shaped like this, the right ones are the opposite. And if you look closely, they really do look like eyes. Next up, we got to talk wheels. Now, there aren't many visual ways to distinguish the regular S-Class from the Maybach, but one of the ways is these wheels. They're absolutely massive. I call them dinner plate wheels because they don't have any spokes in them. They're just one giant silver face. It's a very old-fashioned look, but to me it also just oozes extravagant wealth, and I think they fit this car perfectly. Another thing that fits this car perfectly is the subtle badging on the outside. I especially like the one that says V12. If you don't know what that means, then you don't really matter, but if you do know, you'll move out of the way because this is somewhat important. Another badge I like is the subtle little M badge on the rear pillar back here. That is the Maybach logo. For most people who don't know, it won't mean anything, but for those of us who do know, well, we also know that the person being chauffeured around in this car can buy your family. Now, for the next interesting item, I move on to the fuel door. There are a couple of interesting quirks about it, one of which is the fact that opening it is electronic. You push on it and then it opens, but it's not a mechanical lever, it's actually an electronic latch, and when you open it, you can see the electronic latch going back into place. Next up, another interesting part of the rear of this car would be the backup camera, which is kind of an unusual situation. Obviously, this car has a backup camera. It's a nice modern luxury car, but you don't see it back there. That's because the backup camera in this car stays hidden until it is needed, until you put it in reverse or turn on the cameras, and then it drops down to to reveal itself. When you shift back into drive or turn the cameras off, the camera retracts back into the trunk so you don't see it. The idea here is that it protects the camera from getting dirty or iced over or whatever, since it's in a little tiny cubby inside the trunk lid when it's not in use. The next item of note on the exterior is the rear door, which is absolutely massive. It is considerably larger than the front door. Now this car is 215 inches in length. That's 8 inches longer than a standard S-Class. And all 8 of those inches are added right here for additional rear seat legroom to enhance the experience of the rear seat passengers. And so we must now enter the rear seat. Now, when you climb into the back seat, the first thing you notice really is the massive size of these rear doors. They're just huge, and simply reaching out to close them is kind of a chore. I strongly suspect the next version of the Maybach S-Class will have some sort of power rear door closer feature. For now, this is what you got. Anyway, now that I'm here in the back seat, it's time for me to tell you all the wonderful reasons why it's great to be a rear passenger in this vehicle. The first reason is obvious. There's just an enormous amount of room back here. You can spread out, and of course there are seat controls for the back seats, so you can adjust your seat and make yourself even more comfortable, but things go well beyond that. How about the fact that there are 3 remote controls for this car? I'm not talking about keyless entry remotes. I mean, there are 3 remote controls for the inside of the car. The theory is 1 is for each individual rear passenger, and then there's 1 more in the front. Now, the rear remote controls can control these little screens you see on the back of the front seats, but you can also use them to control the infotainment system in front, which is just hilarious. You don't like what radio station the driver's listening to? Just get out your remote control and you can adjust it yourself. Of course, this could also turn into a massive battle back here, since 3 different people can be using the remote at the same time while the driver is also operating the infotainment system using the little touchpad thing, so everybody could have a say on what we're listening to. To me, it's especially unusual that there's a remote for the front seat, given that the controls for the infotainment system are directly in between the 2 front seats. They're never more than about 8 inches away from the driver or the passenger. Nonetheless, there's a remote just in case you don't want to reach those 8 inches. Next up, what would the rear seat in a Maybach be if there weren't picnic tables? And so this car has picnic tables. You open up the little center compartment with the Maybach logo on it, and then you can pull out individual picnic tables, 1 for this seat and 1 for the other seat. There are even 2 picnic table modes. You can have it in small picnic table in case you're just having a light snack, or you can open it completely in case you're having a full picnic. And then we move on to the refrigerator. Now, your car in the back may have a little cargo compartment. This thing has a little cargo compartment that's a refrigerator. You open it up and it's quite large, and there's even a little cutout so you can put a champagne bottle or a wine bottle back there and keep it chilled. And you know you can keep it chilled because you can press a little button at the bottom of the refrigerator to turn on the chill. There are even 2 different levels of cold for the refrigerator back there. And if that wasn't enough, it's just like your home refrigerator in the sense that when you open the door, a little light comes on. When you close the door, the little light goes off. They really wanted to replicate that refrigerator experience you know so well from your kitchen. Next up, we got to talk about the seat adjustments. Now, this is a nice car, so obviously you're able to use these controls here on the door to move the rear seat. That's not all that unusual. Also, if you press this little button here on the door panel, you can use these controls to move the front seat forward, which gives the rear seat occupant a little more room. You can only do this with the front passenger seat and not the driver's seat. This also is pretty common in these luxury cars. What isn't common? On that side, on the driver's side, you have 3 different memory settings. On the passenger side, you only have 2 memory settings because the space where the third one is taken up by a button that shows a seat lying down. What happens there is if you push the lying down button, the front seat starts to move forward into basically its furthest front position. And then the rear seat starts to do its thing, retracting this giant little leg support thing underneath the seat to give you the most amount of room. So now you can just lie down back here at the expense of the legroom in the front seat. There's this giant rear compartment, and you can just lie down here like a business class airplane seat. But we aren't done yet with the crazy seat stuff. Now, check this out. You can move the front seat forward so you have more legroom if you're sitting here in the rear passenger seat, but If you move the front seat all the way forward, it stops and you're supposed to stop moving it. However, if you push it again after it has stopped once, you can keep moving it forward. In fact, it lets you move it so far forward that, look at this, look under the seat. You can see like all the mechanisms and stuff. I can lay down just fine when the seat stops the first time. I guess it lets you move it this far forward in case you want to lay down in the back of this car and you're 11 feet tall. Or maybe if you want to lay down in the back of this car and you also have a Saint Bernard who wants to lay down in the back of this car. It's crazy how far forward that seat moves. Also crazy is the fact that from back here, you don't just adjust the front seat, you can also adjust the front seat headrest. You can put the front seat headrest all the way down if you simply don't like looking at it. And check this out, when you move the front seat back into position, the little screen on the back of the front seat adjusts ever so slightly in order to make sure that it's tilted at the proper angle so that you can see it if you're sitting in the back seat. Next up, a few other interesting rear seat details, starting with the headrests. Now, the headrests are very nice. They're power operated by that little switch on the door, but beyond that, they have pillows, like your bed. You lean back, oh, and then I turn on my ventilated seat, and really, it's better than my bed. And speaking of the ventilated seats, of course the seats back here are heated and cooled, but check this out, so are the cup holders. Open up the little compartment with the cup holders in them, and you'll see there's a button to make them heated or cooled. And look at this, as you change from heated or cooled, it actually changes color, red for heated, blue for cooled, depending on whether you want your drink to be hot or cold. Next up, the windows back here have rear sunshades. If you pull up on the power window control when the window is already up, the sunshade will go up into place and shade you from the sun. That's pretty standard. Most luxury cars have that, but check this out. The tiny little rear quarter window also has its own separate sunshade, and the crazy thing is how much sun could possibly come through this window. It's not like it's ever going to affect you or bother you, but when you're spending this much money on a car, I guess they do it anyway. And speaking of the door panel, one other thing worth mentioning, if you look at the bottom of the door panel, you will see a cup holder down there that isn't just a cup holder, it's a velvet cup holder. Look at that. I guess to prevent your drink from sliding around. It also has a little place for you to store your remote control so that you don't lose it and have to borrow one of the other two remote controls in this vehicle. And of course, this car also has mirrors in the ceiling. They have nice little mood lights around them so you know that they're there even at night, so you can push on them and you can look at yourself. Also interesting back here is the seat belts. They're fairly standard seat belts, but they have two kind of cool quirks to them. One is when you open up the door, the belt buckle slides out automatically so you know where it is, so it doesn't get lost inside the folds of the leather seat. When you close the door, it retracts right back into its home. It also has a little light on it to make it even easier to find. Also interesting about the seat belts is they have airbags in them. If you get in an accident, the front people have all the airbags. Well, not in this car. The seat belts have little seat belt airbags, which are designed to help prevent injury. Obviously, when you're sitting back here, if you push a little button, you can retract the cover on the sunroof. That's not all that interesting. What is interesting is the fact that the sunroof is blue. Why is that? Well, that's because the sunroof automatically adjusts itself based on the sunlight. If it's beating down with sun like right now, it turns bluer in order to keep more sunlight out. On a cloudy day, it becomes clear and the same amount comes in, and that way you're never bothered by excessive sunlight in the back of your Maybach. Next up, we move on to the front of the S600 Maybach, where there is a further long list of insanity. But before I get to it, I want you to just sort of look at everything. First off, look at this silver wood trim that comes from the finest silver trees, of course. But really, it's just beautiful, and so is everything else. Look at the dashboard. It's leather, but there's also this cross-stitched pattern that's just absolutely gorgeous. And the seat trim is just absolutely fantastic, soft leather, and it looks beautiful. Everything is hand-stitched and just truly wonderful and excellent. I also like the attention to detail in the V12 badges on the seat backs. That's also carried over to the rear seats. They also have V12 badges, and if you think you know that font from somewhere, that's because it's the same font they're using on the front fender to make the V12 badge up there. That's kind of a cool little touch. Now, on that same subject, before I get into the weird buttons and switches, and before I show you the infotainment system quirks, I want to show you some of the most interesting pieces of attention to detail I'm going to start with the center console. Now, the center console, you're sitting in the driver's seat, you push a little button and then it opens toward the driver, and so you're thinking, well, that means the passenger doesn't have access to the center console in a $200,000 car? Not quite. Close the center console, push the same button on the other side, and then it opens toward the passenger. It's hinged on both sides. Another interesting example of attention to detail, take a look at the climate control vent closers. These little things, you can twist them to close and open the climate control vents if you want more or less air. But take a look at this. Say you've adjusted the climate control vents to allow the amount of air in that you want. Well, then you can just push this thing in and then it's out of the way and you don't have to look at these adjusters. The dashboard can have its flowing plane of beauty, not broken up by these little pieces. One other interesting item of attention to detail, if you open up this little compartment in the front of the center console, you'll see that there are no cup holders in there, but if you tap the back of it, you'll find that there are cup holders. But take a look at that again. If you tap the back of it, the lid opens ever so slowly. It doesn't want to startle you when revealing your cup holders. Another cool item of attention to detail, take a look at the buttons inside the center controls. You see how they're sort of arranged like that? Well, the buttons on top and the buttons on the side sort of come together in this flowing line. It's a very beautiful detail. I've never seen any automaker before use the space in between the buttons as a point of style. But they have done that in this car, and frankly, it looks pretty cool. Anyway, on to some of the weird quirks and features of this car. I want to start with the steering wheel situation. Now, if you take a look at the steering wheel with the gauges behind it, you can't not see a clown face. The gauges are the eyes, the Mercedes-Benz logo is the nose, and the steering wheel bottom is just smiling this giant big smile because there's no third spoke on the bottom of the steering wheel. Once you see it, it's impossible not to see it every time you climb behind the wheel of any S-Class from this generation. Next up, you open up the sun visor. It's a fairly normal sun visor, and there's a warning label on there. What is it? The airbag warning? Is it a seatbelt warning? No, it's a warning to remind you not to leave your keys in the car. I'm not really sure why they chose that location. I've seen roadside assistance on there, airbags, but never the don't leave your keys in the car warning on the sun visor. Next up, going through the buttons between the gauge cluster and the infotainment screen, one of them, it's a headrest with some arrows. Well, that button puts the rear headrests up or down. Now, in a lot of luxury cars, you can drop the rear headrests so you have better rear visibility, and they just sort of fall down with one mechanical motion. This thing, you push that button, and they automatically whir down gently. You push the button again, and then they whir back up into place. Next up, we got to talk about the Maybach logos. Now, I figured this car, they would go all out putting Maybach logos over everything to make you feel like you're very rich, which of course you are, but actually they've done it pretty tastefully. It's all fairly reserved. This car is relatively subtle despite the high-end brand name. One place you won't find the Maybach logo, why, that would be on the rear trunk. That's because this car has been debadged by the prior owner, and all of the letters are right here in the glove box. Give me a May, give me a Bach. Well, I have to go in there and get those letters. I'm not going to do that. Also, one other place where there's a Maybach logo, if you open up the glove box, you will see the perfume canister. That little canister, you can go into the infotainment system and it will spray the perfume through the climate control vents and keep the car nice and fresh scented. You can also exchange it for other Maybach perfume canisters if you prefer a different smell. On the door panel, starting with, you have the heated seat and the cooled seat controls in the door panel, but if you look, the heated seat control is vastly larger than the cooled seat control. It's like twice the size. I guess they figure you're going to want to heat your seat twice as often. Next up, we move on to the infotainment and tech quirks inside the S600 Maybach. You can choose between various different types of routes. You can choose the fastest route and time, the shortest route and distance, the eco route for green drivers, but you can also choose the dynamic route. In other words, the route that's going to be the most fun. I've never seen this as an option before. I find it odd that I'm first seeing it in the Maybach S600, but it's kind of a cool idea. You want to go the back twisty way? You can tell the navigation system and it'll send you down more fun roads. Another interesting navigation system thing, if you click on Where Am I, it brings up a very detailed position with all the coordinates where you exactly are. It also shows a map and it shows what satellite number you're on. I don't really know what that means, but it's there. And next up, moving on to the radio settings, and check this out. You go to the radio and you're not really sure what channel you want. Maybe your rear seat passengers would be better to decide. Well, you can click or send this application to another seat, and then you can take what's on this screen and send it to a rear screen so your rear passengers can decide what you should be listening to. Of course, they could also just sort of sit back there and play with the remote and look up at this screen, but why look so far when they could simply look at their own? A couple of other cool radio items. One is the equalizer. Check this out. These are like old school radio dials, even though they're inside this giant screen in this modern luxury car. That is a really cool look. I also like the look of the diagrams that appear when you're trying to choose which type of radio you want. You have FM with a normal sized tower, AM with a larger tower, which is accurate, and then there's satellite radio with a picture of the globe. Those are some interesting diagrams that most people probably will never see. Next up, moving on to vehicle settings, there are a couple of interesting ones, starting with tow-away protection.
Unfortunately, tow-away protection doesn't release some sort of angry jungle animal if a tow truck driver tries to tow you away. Instead, turn it on and the car alarm goes off if the car senses the angle is changing, like it's being loaded into a tow truck.
Next up, check this out. I already showed you the seat controls. They're on the door panel, and it's the same in the back, but there are more seat controls than just that, and you adjust them in the infotainment screen. You can adjust sort of the backrest tightness and your lumbar support, and it's very odd. As you turn the dial, you actually feel it happening in real time in the seat, which is kind of an unusual feeling. Next up, we move into the gauge cluster, which has the exact same size screen as the center infotainment system. Press a little button below the gauge cluster and night vision turns on, and it sort of illuminates what's in front of you on a dark road. In my opinion, it's a very cool feature, though I'm told not that many people actually use it. I use it all the time in my Mercedes-Benz. The interesting thing about night vision is when you press it, watch the gauges sort of tighten up so they can still get the exact same amount of speed on the gauge, even though they're also displaying the night vision screen. Another interesting segment of the gauge cluster is the part that tells you how much fuel you have remaining. Instead of just showing a half, 3/4 thing like every other car, it gives you a percentage, like battery life on your phone. Maybe they figure now that everybody's used to percentages of battery life on their phone, they'd rather see that instead of fuel amount. Finally, the last interesting thing in the gauge cluster is the dipped beam settings. This is really cool. You can choose between left-hand drive and right-hand drive. So if you're driving this car in a left-hand drive country, the light won't be shining directly in the face of oncoming traffic. It'll actually adjust the lights so that it's correct regardless of which side of the road you're driving on, and that is a cool idea. Next up, we move on to the trunk. The trunk space in this car is actually smaller than the trunk space in a regular S-Class, even though this one is much larger. And the reason for that is, well, there's a refrigerator back here. It's obviously the refrigerator from the rear seats pokes its way into the trunk, and it takes up considerable space. You might not be able to get all 4 golf bags in here quite as easily if you also plan on chilling your drinks in the back. And so that's a tour of the flagship Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the Mercedes-Maybach S600. But if you're still wondering how you could possibly pay $200,000 for an S-Class, maybe it'll help if I take it out on the road and show you how it drives. Man, this is a serious car. So the first thing you feel when you get inside this thing is just massive, and you could tell. I mean, it's just huge. It's the regular S-Class is already pretty massive, but this thing takes it to the next level of massive. It is also just serene in here. You don't hear a thing. It's just completely and utterly silent, as it should be. That's what I expect given the price of this vehicle. It's actually surprisingly secure in terms of handling. It moves relatively quickly when you turn the wheel, which is surprising considering its massive heft and the fact that it's not supposed to be like a sports car or anything. Oh man, you go over these speed bumps. I mean, you can feel them because they're giant speed bumps, but like you're not bothered by them like you are in so many cars. In my rental car, I get up to there and it's like you got to inch over it or else it's going to be uncomfortable. This thing is not like that at all. It's just completely takes you out of it. You're just like, yeah, whatever, a bump, that doesn't matter. I don't care. This thing is great. It's just serene. You literally hear nothing. I mean, I can't hear there's a train next to me and I can hear nothing of it. It is just beautifully perfect. Yeah, surprisingly reasonable handling in terms of going around the corner. I mean, there's some body roll. Even at lower speeds, you can tell there's body roll. And the steering isn't tremendously precise, but it's better than I would expect considering I kind of view this as like a limo. It does better than I would think it would. The really impressive thing is just how smooth it is, my God. And it just feels so nice. And the way a V12 builds power, I mean, you put your foot down and you can just sort of, it doesn't come on like one of those boy racer sports cars. It just sort of washes over you like a jet. It's just beautiful. It's just a shame that I have to share the road with these normal, everyday automobiles and people. The thing is, this car is not about being a sports car. It's not about being a performance car or anything like that, although it is relatively quick, especially given its heft. But that'll happen when you put a twin-turbo V12 in something. It's not about that. It's about just sort of this serenity. And I gotta be honest, this serenity is what you get in a Rolls-Royce. They've managed to tune out even more than the regular S-Class, which already does a pretty nice job of it. This thing just feels even more serene and peaceful and beautifully quiet. Man, going normal traffic speed, just sort of sitting in traffic behind somebody going like 5 miles an hour, this car is just the place to be. Nothing can annoy you. Even in traffic, this person's going far too slowly. I have no idea why, but how could I possibly be annoying? I'm being comforted in so many ways. I've got my cooled seat on. I could have the massage on if I wanted. It's just so wonderful and so lovely, and it just feels so serene. And so that's the Mercedes-Maybach S600, the flagship S-Class, the luxury S-Class for people who find the regular S-Class to be a little too common among other rich people. This is the most luxurious Mercedes-Benz you can buy, and even though it's dramatically more expensive than a regular S550, it's easy to understand why. And now it's time to give it a Doug score.
Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Maybach S600 is fine. The design is a little familiar since it's based on the S-Class. It's nothing special, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in a ridiculous 4.7 seconds, which gives it a 6 out of 10. Handling is okay, secure and predictable, but light steering and there's body roll, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Fun factor is low. The car is not that much fun to drive, but that's not really the point. It's big and fast, and it has a presence, but mostly it's just dull, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Cool factor is not as high as the old Maybach, which had a separate design. Now it's just an S-Class Denali, and it gets a 5 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 27 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories, starting with features. It has an enormous amount of stuff, but it's behind on some modern gadgets. I have no doubt the facelift version would do a little bit better, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Comfort is among the best of the best, and it gets a 10 out of 10. Quality is very high on the inside, but I worry a lot about long-term reliability, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Practicality is okay, though you'd think a car like this would have more space, but that refrigerator really takes up a lot of cargo room, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Value is debatable. It's going to lose a lot of value fast, which is usually a problem, but it also provides Rolls-Royce and Bentley comfort for less money, suggesting it's a good value. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 37 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 64 out of 100, and you can see where it lands. The Maybach S600 ties the Bentley Mulsanne overall, but the Maybach has a higher daily score, mainly because it's cheaper. The Maybach loses to the Rolls-Royce Phantom, which is the ultimate luxury sedan. Interestingly, the Maybach also loses to the BMW M760i, which has better tech, sharper performance, and similar comfort. I'd probably get the BMW over the Maybach S600 if I were in this market.